Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Barbara Hannon, and I am the author of this book called Letters from World War II. It's the story of my parents and what they went through during World War II. This picture is my parents' wedding picture, and it sat on our buffet in the dining room for 40 years. But this is my dad in his uniform. My parents were married June 19th, 1943. And I am the author of a book that details their lives during World War II, mostly what happened to my dad during the war. And it is a story that I never knew. Like a lot of kids growing up as the children of the post-World War II generation, my parents never talked about the war. They never talked about what happened. And I think that was true for a lot of the World War II generation. I think when they came back from the war, like my dad, and got on with their lives, they just put it all behind them and never talked about it, which was extremely true for my parents growing up. I had no idea what they went through. You know, it wasn't that we didn't know some things about World War II. My parents would make comments now and then. My mother would say things like, when your dad was in prison camp, blah, blah, blah. I also, looking back at my dad's behavior, now retrospectively, my dad had a lot of behavior that should have clued us in that maybe something bad happened during the war. But, you know, at the time, we know today what hoarding is all about, for instance. But when I was growing up, our dad was just a little peculiar. So my dad was a food hoarder. And growing up, at any given time in our house, we had enough food to feed an army. In fact, in our basement, we had this huge pantry, and it was stocked full of food. There was food stashed all over our house. My mother would say things like, you know, why don't you go down in the basement and get a couple cans of tuna fish for lunch, and we'll have tuna fish sandwiches. And I'd go down to the pantry in the basement, which had a lock on it. There was never 1 or 2 cans of tuna. There were 30. There were stacks of sardines any kind of canned vegetable, canned soup, boxes of pudding. I'd open a closet upstairs and there were cans of Folgers coffee everywhere. Boxes and boxes of saltines. I'd trip over them going up the basement stairs. But, it wasn't just food that my dad hoarded. It was soap, shampoo. We had a stairway that went up into our attic, and you'd open the door to the stairs going up to the attic, and there were boxes and boxes of soap, shampoo, toothpaste. My sisters and I used to joke, we never had to go to a drugstore to get shampoo. We'd just go to the attic stairs, and there would be bottles and bottles. Maybe some of you remember that green Prel shampoo. Well, there were just bottles and bottles of shampoo. We never really thought there was anything odd about all this. But now that I know the story of what happened to my dad, these were the things he did not have in prison camp and was never going to be without them again. That was just sort of one hint. And I think the fact that there was a padlock on this food pantry in the basement, I asked him once, why is there a lock on that pantry door? And I remember he said, because you never know who's going to take your food. So looking back, I think there were lots of hints that my dad may have gone through something horrific during the war, but again, he never talked about it. We didn't really think about it. It wasn't a subject of conversation. We just did not know. The only thing we knew about our dad in World War II is that our family celebrated Jump Day every January 11th. Every January 11th. I came home from college my very first year over Christmas break, January, and my dad came down from upstairs on January 11th into the kitchen, just like he always did, put up his hands and said, it's Jump Day, let's have pancakes. And we used to have celebratory pancakes every January 11th. In fact, a friend of mine who I've known since grade school emailed me this past January and said, it's Jump Day, are you having pancakes? So as young kids growing up, what we knew about Jump Day was that our dad jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, and he jumped out of this plane and he landed in the snow, took his parachute off, he buried it in the snow, and then he and the other guys from the plane started walking, and they were picked up by what he called the German police. And then he was in a prison camp. So did we think this was bad? We didn't know why it was on a plane. We didn't know why he jumped out of the plane for sure. We didn't know as young kids. In this prison camp, we asked him what this prison camp was because he always called it prison camp. He never called it prison. And he said, well, we lived in cabins. We slept on bunk beds. Sometimes we cooked our food outside on a grill. We played a lot of baseball. We played card games. To a young kid, that sounded an awful lot like summer camp. So our dad jumped out of a plane, and I guess he was in summer camp. That is about the extent of what we knew about World War II growing up. As we got older, of course, he explained that he was a navigator on a B-17. He was stationed in England, don't know where at the time, and his plane was shot down. He bailed out, and he was captured and spent the war in a prison camp. So we knew that much. But never growing up, my sisters and I talked about this, never growing up did we ever get a sense that something bad may have happened. I think the closest we got to that was, I don't know if any of you out there remember the show Hogan's Heroes. It was on in the 60s. we had a TV room in our house. And one night, my sisters and I were kind of laying around these couches and watching Hogan's Heroes. We were laughing. And my dad came in the TV room, as we called it, and he watched for a few minutes. And then he went over and shut the TV off. And he looked at all of us and said, "Don't ever watch this show. The German guards were not stupid. They were mean." And he walked out of the room. My sisters and I, of course, were like, "What? What's he talking about?" We just did not know the story. And that I didn't know the story of what happened to my dad until I wrote this book. So what happened to make me write this book was my mother died. And my mother lived in the same house that we grew up in for over 60 years. My sisters and I thought we knew everything that was in this house. And when she died, we were cleaning out the house, and in the back of her bedroom closet were two boxes. One was a cardboard box about this big, about this high, had a top on it. And the other box was wooden. It was a wooden box with a wooden top. It was quite a bit bigger. And I opened the first box, and it was full of letters, all these letters. And they were grouped and tied with different color ribbons. And sitting on the floor of her closet, I picked up the first group of letters, and the return address was Santa Ana Air Base, California. And I knew that's where he went to navigation school during the war. And I looked at the postmarks and the dates, and they were 1942. I picked up the next group of letters, which were more letters, and the return address was Ridgewell Air Base, Essex, England. And it said 381st Bomb Group, 533rd Squadron. And I thought, well, this is the air base my dad was at in England. I had no idea. And then the next set of letters I picked up were very strange. I'd never seen them before. They were not in envelopes, but they were kind of long and thin, and they folded. And on the front, it was German all over the front, Mit Luftposte. And it said Stalag Luft 1, POW Camp, Barth, Germany, POW number 2172, which was my dad's German POW number. I was thrilled, whole stack of them. And then the last letters group I picked up, I looked, and it said Camp Lucky Strike, St. Valery, France. And I looked at my sister, who was sitting on the floor of the closet with me, and I said, "Look at these. They're from France. Did you know Dad was in France? Why was he in France? What was he doing in France?" I had no idea. So I put the lid back on that, and then I opened this wooden box. This wooden box, about this big, deep, was crammed full of all kinds of papers. I didn't take time to look at them then. I just looked at the amount of papers. And like my dad being a food hoarder, he kept every piece of paper, every document, every telegram from World War II and the time he was in the service. Also in this box were French francs, a bunch of French francs. And I looked them up later on the internet, and they were wartime French francs. And there were German Reichsmarks, just all this incredible stuff. So I packed up these boxes and I took them to my house. The plan was when I retired, I would go through these, read these letters, look at these papers, and just, look at them. So then COVID hit, and I needed a project for COVID. And one morning I made a big pot of coffee, sat down at the table, and I went through the wooden box with these documents first. I kind of emotionally was not ready to read the letters, but I thought I'll start and look at some of these documents. And the very first document that I picked up was pink, and it was a Western Union telegram to my mother with 2 big gold stars on it, which I have since learned is that a telegram with gold stars meant it was from the War Department. So I looked at this telegram, and it said, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant George Hannon, has been missing over Germany since January 11th, 1944. And I looked at that, and I looked at the date. My mother got that telegram, and it was January 26th. Knowing Jump Day was January 11th, my mother didn't know for almost 2 weeks that he was even missing. I then looked through the box, and I found a second telegram that was February 17th, 1944. And it said, "The Secretary of War would like to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant Hannon, has been reported as a prisoner of the Germans by the International Red Cross." And I thought, wait a minute, that's 37 days. 37 days. My mom did not know if he was dead or alive. And I suddenly thought about my mother. She didn't, 37 days, she didn't know that he was dead or alive. She was a school teacher, and she had to get up every day, take about an hour's bus ride to this high school she taught at. 37 days. She got up, got on this bus, went to school, and she didn't know. It wasn't until I found a telegram from April 1944 that said he was a prisoner of war of the Germans at Stalag Luft 1, and she could write to him using his German POW number 2172. So that was the very first thing that I did, is put together this timeline. And all I could do was think about my mother day after day after day, not knowing if he was dead or alive. And I put together this timeline from 1942 to 1945. For 3 years, my parents were separated. They got married June 19th. August 3rd, my father got on a plane, flew to England, and didn't come home for 2 years. So I wanted to know what happened. I wanted to know the story, but I wasn't quite ready to read all the letters yet. Instead, I began to do a whole lot of research on Stalag Luft 1, this prison camp, the air base in England, the 381st. I just did tons of research, and to learn what my dad was going through at this time, and was really pretty surprised. When my dad was flying in England in 1943 and early 1944, it was a slaughterhouse for people like my dad. He had a 1 in 4 chance of making it through to 25 missions. Bailing out of a plane, you had about 60% chance in the middle of an air battle of making it to the ground. I started reading about this prison camp and discovered that these airmen, 8,000 airmen that were at Stalag Luft 1, were starved. I found a medical record that listed my dad's weight at 165 pounds when he was at Santa Ana in flight school. When he arrived at St. Valery, France, after being rescued from this prison camp, my dad weighed about 114 pounds. So my dad lost 50 pounds in prison camp. So I put together the story beginning when my dad enlisted and went to flight school. Then I started reading the letters from these different places and began to match the letters to some of the documents, the telegrams, to figure out what happened. When I began to read the letters, I think it was difficult for my sisters and I to read these letters. First of all, you kind of feel like a voyeur. You don't really expect your parents to write letters like this. So full of love and passion. And I started reading the letters and was stunned. I could only read a few letters at a time and discovered a lot from these letters. For instance, my dad's letters from England. As you read them, he starts out being really excited to be in England. And he wrote my mother this great letter that he had been to London for the first time, and he had been at Buckingham Palace, and he had been to Westminster Abbey. And he was so excited. He had been at Piccadilly Circus. In fact, in his box of stuff, there was a subway token for Piccadilly Circus, 1943, October 1943. But as the war progressed in England and as he flew more flights, my dad clearly was frightened. I think he wrote to my mother things like, "It gets harder and harder to get up in the plane every day because you don't know what happens and your life hangs in the balance until you see the coast of England again." But then he wrote, "But I signed up for this and I will do this job to the best of my ability, no matter what happens." And my mother did nothing but write these supportive letters, how proud she was of him. And I realized I was so proud of my dad. In these 80 letters between the two of them from 1941 to 1945, there's never any anger. There's never any whining. There's never any "why me?" Nothing. Just these positive letters with a lot of commitment to each other. My dad certainly to the war. So what I decided to do was tell the story of what happened to my dad through the letters, because in his letters to her, he explained a lot of things. Although a lot of his letters to my mom from this prison camp in Germany were censored. You'd start reading and there'd be a whole section blacked out where my dad couldn't maybe say how bad things were, but they were bad at this prison camp. And yet he never said anything to my mother. He never said, "We're hungry," nothing. So I wrote this story through their letters, and I wanted to show what a commitment they had to each other, what a commitment my dad had to the war, no matter what happens. He was pretty committed. And I wanted to show how their love for each other through these letters kept him going. The letters are quite diverse. In one letter, my dad just flat out wrote, "Your letters are what's keeping me going every day." And my mother wrote at least 2 letters a week to him. Although we discovered that when my dad got a letter, he wrote the date he received it. It took 4 months for a letter from my mom to get to him. It took 4 months for a letter from him to get to her. So I wanted to do something with all these letters, these telegrams, these documents. So what I did was start scanning all of them into a digital file. And one of the things that we have is my dad's prisoner of war record. It's got his picture on the front. It's all in German. And I could kind of solidify the dates from this, the date he arrived at the prison camp. But I turned over to the back of this record and I couldn't read it. So I had to find someone to translate the German on this prisoner of war record. And the person that translated this for me turned it over and showed me the back. And on the back was this list of dates, like March 3rd to March 8th, April 3rd to April 10th, all these weird dates. And he said, these are punishments. These are times that your dad would have been in what the Germans called the cooler, in solitary confinement for breaking the rules, digging tunnels, or something that the Germans called insurrection, meaning if 3 or 4 guys were together talking and said anything about the German guards or anything, bang. So realizing that my dad was starved, there were punishments going on. My mother didn't know because he couldn't write about it. But I did a lot of research on exactly what happened in this camp and how the camp was liberated. And I won't tell you how the camp was liberated. You have to read the book to find out how my dad and these other 8,000 U.S. Air Force guys were rescued under the nose of the Russians, because where my dad's camp was clear up on the Baltic in northern Germany, and it, of course, became East Germany. And the story of how my dad was rescued from this camp is a story that almost didn't happen. I was really surprised what happened. And when I look back on my dad's, a lot of his behavior, my dad never would take us to see the fireworks. For instance, my dad did not want to go to fireworks. We never went as kids because he would not drive us to see fireworks. He didn't want to see them. Probably some measure of PTSD. But overall, I decided to put all the letters, and I scanned most of the documents into this book to tell the story. I originally wrote the book because I wanted to know what happened. I wrote it for his grandchildren and now his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so that they would know what their grandfather did during the war. And I wrote it because it's really a timeless story. I think a lot of people today cannot understand what this kind of sacrifice was. I mean, 3 years, my parents didn't see each other. What that kind of sacrifice is unbelievable. And to do it with such grace and with such commitment, and never, ever a word about the war. Never, what a terrible war. Never, just these positive letters to keep each other's spirits up. I think the very hardest letters to read out of all these 80 letters were the letters that my parents wrote each other every Christmas Eve. My dad wrote my mom one, even though my mom didn't get it until 4 months after she wrote it. My mother would write a letter, and they were the same. They'd write each other, "Merry Christmas, darling. I know in my heart this is the last year we'll ever be apart, and then we'll spend every Christmas together for as long as we have." Both of them wrote the same thing, year after year. And yet, another year went by. So that is my book. If you want to know what happened to my dad and how he got rescued, please read it. The letters are in it. I have letters in here, documents in here, his prisoner of war documents. There's even a commendation from my dad from Winston Churchill. I looked at that and went, whoa, W.C., whoa. So I'm very proud of my parents. And it was hard work doing all the research. I wrote for records from the National Archives, from the National Military Archives, to find out exactly what happened to my dad's plane. How did it get shot down? what happened. You know, and all the time I was writing this book with all these questions, I thought, I could have just asked my mom. I could have just asked my dad, what happened? Why were you in France? But I didn't know. And I think as a daughter, it was good for me to do the research and find out. So that's my book. And I thank all of you for listening to me talk about it. I can talk about it endlessly because I am so proud of my parents. So thank you very much for listening. Anybody else have a question? I've seen a couple here at the bottom. Somebody asked exactly what your parents did. My father was a first lieutenant in the 8th Air Force. He graduated as a navigator in June 19th, 1943. What happened is that he asked my mom to marry him, and she got on the train in Iowa all by herself and went out to Mather Field in Sacramento, where he was finishing his navigator training. She went out by herself. He graduated at 10 o'clock in the morning and got his commission. And then they stood in line at the base chapel. And my mom did tell us it was an assembly line. They stood in line and got married in the afternoon. They had a 1-week honeymoon. My dad, the hoarder, has a bill from the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. There is a menu from a Chinese restaurant. There's a picture of my mom standing on the Golden Gate Bridge. So they had a 1-week's honeymoon. My mom had to go back to Iowa because my dad had to go do 100 flight hours, and he was in Spokane at Geiger Field, and there was no married housing there, so my mom could go with him. She went back home alone, a married woman, and then my dad was gone, flew over to England. And the very first letter she got from him in England said, I got us here from Grand Island, Nebraska. He describes flying over Niagara Falls, and then they flew to Ireland, and then they flew down to Essex. And he wrote, I landed here right on target. I'm very proud of myself. The other thing in this letter was pretty hilarious. He said, we flew over Cedar Rapids, Iowa about 10 o'clock Sunday. Did you see us? We circled the house and got as low as we could and buzzed your house. Well, a thundering B-17 on an August Sunday morning in a quiet Iowa town, of course. But, you know, I wish I could ask my mom, did you go out and wave and see them? They got as low as they could. But that's the kind of stuff that's in these letters. So some of them funny, a lot of them very poignant. And I'm glad I read them. I will tell you that when we first started reading these letters, my sisters and I were unsure if we should read these. You know, we felt kind of like voyeurs. And one of my sisters said, our mom lived to be 93. Before she died, she worked really hard to get rid of 60 years worth of stuff in her house. And we would go over there and she'd have 3 more boxes for Goodwill. But she never threw these letters away. She never threw these documents away. They were tucked safely in the back of her closet. And I think my sisters and I believe from our heart that while my mother was alive, she could not talk about World War II. But after she died, I think she wanted us to read the letters. So we did, and I'm so glad I did. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.